The date is May 7th, 1824. Beethoven hasn't premiered a symphony in 12 years. And finally, it's going to be the premiere of this 9th symphony. This is the happening of the decade. Everyone is there. All the important people, all the politicians, all the benefactors, and Beethoven comes out. By this time, he is completely deaf, but he wants so much to be involved. He's the creator. The conductor that prepared it said, listen, musicians, no matter what, don't look at Beethoven. Beethoven looks crazy. I mean, he's jumping around and he's gesticulating. All the musicians are just trying to play, trying not to pay any attention to this guy.
The music finished and they started applauding. And Beethoven was still with his head in the score, conducting away. And one of the soloists, Carolina Unger, grabbed him and turned him around so he could see the audience. And he seemed to be confused because he had been in the middle of the piece somewhere. And then the audience saw this and they started applauding louder and louder. And he couldn't hear it. And this is one of the saddest moments in his life. And also at the same time, it's one of the most triumphant moments in his life.
We finite beings are born to suffer both pain and joy. One might say that the best of us obtain joy through suffering.
And out of this experience, he builds a piece that resonates and can mean different things to everyone. Not just on May 7th, 1824, but today and tomorrow, because it's a piece about connecting, and this is fundamental to human existence.
In 1792, at the age of 21, Beethoven arrives in Vienna. Vienna, at that moment, is a city overflowing with music. Music is everywhere. Into that scene comes Beethoven from a state of absolute anonymity. Within less than a year, he creates a really big name for himself. As he has been doing since he was a kid, he expects to conquer the city very quickly as a performer, because this is something he has been doing forever.
On the 17th December 1770, the Beethoven family gathered here in the St. Remigius church in Bonn to baptize the child Ludwig van Beethoven. Having this name bears a big legacy. It's the name of the grandfather, who is a highly respected musician and kapellmeister here in Bonn. There's a kind of hidden agenda behind it. There's a secret hope that the young Ludwig van Beethoven will surpass the career of his grandfather.
Beethoven had a traumatic childhood, it has to be said. The father was drinking too much. He was alcoholic. He was reeling around the place, obviously drowning his own sorrows because he was not a success. And it was one of these typical situations where a parent who has not really succeeded in the career that his own parents wanted him to follow, so he more than forces it onto Ludwig. Ludwig, being the oldest of his siblings, the first of 3 children, he's trying to appease his parents in every way. There's an extra pressure because you're supposed to be setting an example. This is a child being dragged out of his bed in the middle of the night to practice. Ludwig somehow gets through all of this and just takes the blows because luckily he loves music. Luckily it gives him something back.
The young Ludwig just wants to sit and improvise at the piano, and his father says, no, you actually have to play the notes that are written first, and then once you have mastered this, that you can actually start to invent things on your own. You'll never really amount to anything if you don't learn how to read the music properly.
Since my 4th year, music has been the first of my youthful pursuits. Having become acquainted early on with this dear muse, I grew to love it. And, as it often appeared to me, it grew to love me in turn.
Johann van Beethoven has understood the talent of his son. He's enough of a musician to realize he has a prodigy on his hands. So he sets up a concert and he advertises it in the paper. The advertisement reads, today, March 26, 1778, the electoral court tenorist, Beethoven, will have the honor to produce 2 of his scholars, Mademoiselle Averdonk, court contraltist, and his little son of 6 years. Beethoven at this point is actually 7. His father changes the age because 6 was the age that Mozart was when he became famous. So Johann van Beethoven is trying to present his son as a new Mozart.
As for mistakes, so far as I am concerned, I have never really had to learn that. Even as a child, I had such a delicacy of feeling that I exercised it without knowing that it had to be thus, or that it could be anything else.
I mean, any instrumentalist who starts training at the early age of 3 or 4, there is this speciality thing. And I'm not even sure if Mozart and Beethoven, as the most important prodigy children in our culture, have ever been told that they are geniuses or they are special or that they are very gifted. They just were treated like, you have to do this. I mean, this is your job. You have to become a musician. So the interplay between the piano-playing gifted child and the parents or the teachers who take the gift as a serious message, this is the important part. And this shouldn't be sadistic, and it shouldn't be, oppressive and too heavy and too severe. Of course, there should be a good interplay. But if everybody treats you differently than any other child, your feeling of self, your image of self, of course, is influenced by that a lot. It's sort of a devastating message to any child.
At age 10, when it has become clear that Beethoven is a prodigy, is something really quite remarkable. He is a tiny, friendless, grubby kid who is in some kind of world of his own all the time. It would later be called his raptus, when he just goes off. And his landlord's daughter accosts him and says, "Why are you so dirty all the time?" And Beethoven says to her, "When I'm grown up and I'm a great man, nobody will care."
The family has very close contacts to all sorts of court members, being workers in different kinds at the court. His father is a singer at the time, and his grandfather, who died already when he was very young, he was even the chapel master of the court chapel in Bonn. Beethoven actually is very lucky to be born into a society where, on a daily basis, he hears very good music played by excellent musicians. The most modern music comes by, like Mozart's symphonies. So Haydn symphonies are copied weeks after they were composed. They have them in Bonn.
We are here now in the Schlosskirche, which is the church of the court. This is the church where Beethoven every morning is playing the organ there. Before noon, he's rehearsing with singers. The afternoon and the evening, he's playing continually in the opera orchestra or in the symphonic productions. And it's real impressive how this child, because he's 11 years old, is surviving in this snake pit of an orchestra environment, which is very difficult and hard. And it proves that he's very talented and self-aware.
Beethoven was employed as court organist in Bonn by the brother of Emperor Joseph from Vienna. And there's one story who tells us how wildly Beethoven played the organ. Beethoven made a bet with a court singer and said, "I can play dissonances so wild that you cannot follow up your melody when you sing the Lamentationes." And in fact, it happened. There was a crash during a court service because Beethoven's harmonies were so wild. And Beethoven got a warning. He was told, "If you do that again, you will be fired." Beethoven the boy shows us already the signs of the composer, of the older man. Wild, going to the extremes, trying out unusual things, and being very creative in his music, be it improvised or written.
Now that I've reached my 11th year, in hours of blissful solitude, my muse has often whispered to me, "Try to write down the harmonies of your soul." I was almost shy, yet it was the will of my muse. I obeyed and wrote.
One of the things about Beethoven that's true from the beginning of his efforts as a composer is that he has the capacity to make huge strides in a very short time. He composes these little Dressler variations on a march by a composer named Dressler.
I should admit that I am not sure if I would just find this piece, I would right away say, "Oh, I see, it's Beethoven." They are very well written already, especially when we know that it's 11-year-old child. But to me, it's right the learning stage of his creative life.
Then, at the age of 14, comes an astronomical leap in the 3 piano quartets. It is a change from an early gallant style to works which are passionate, structured, very mature and very Beethovenian. I think that's the key point, that they are much closer to his mature voice than the works he has written before, and it does not seem to be gradual. The E-flat major concerto seems to come from another planet. And very shortly after the beginning, music stops completely, and there is a motif of 4 notes, just bare 4 notes. And this emptiness of letting all the voices die and just concentrating on these 4 notes, almost minimalistic, is something which he is going to explore to a great and very deep extent in his late string quartets. And to find a seed of it in a work he wrote as a 14 is quite breathtaking, very moving.
So this is the very first letter we know from Beethoven. It has been written on September 15th, 1787. At this time, Beethoven is 16 years old, so he is the eldest of 3 or 4 children, and Beethoven's father is very sad, drinking more than ever. His mother died 2 months ago, and mother is missing very hardly.
She was my best friend. Oh, who was happier than I, when I could still utter the sweet name of mother, and heed was paid to it. And to whom can I say it now? To the dumb pictures resembling her, the creations of my imagination.
So we see a boy trying to explain his emotional and material situation, and this is really touching.
It's clear that Ludwig has been forced through every stage of his life, unlike most children who work their way through their lives organically. And then when his mother died, when he's 16 years of age, he suddenly has to become an adult. No choice. And he takes that role on with full compassion. And even though he's never experienced empathy or compassion from his own father, he is trying to do what he thinks is right in the best way he knows.
The death of his mother, in effect, ends his childhood. He's making the money, and he is keeping Dad together, and he's keeping the family together. He is basically running his younger brother's life. And that marks him for life as well. He always considered himself the older brother who was telling his younger brothers what to do.
The traumatic effect of this measure can't be overestimated and leaves a mark on Beethoven's psyche.
I think the addiction part of the father personality is playing a big role in the formation of Beethoven. If you have an addicted father, I mean, that makes every childhood really tough and really unpredictable and prone to all sorts of eruptions, and on the other side also love and affection. So as the object is twofold, it's to be hated and you still love him. The only way to deal with the father object that's in this addiction situation is to go away, to really abandon the object.
In 1792, Beethoven travels to Vienna. Vienna is the cultural capital, attracting like a magnet all the famous artists and musicians of the period. Mozart has just died 1 year before, and Haydn is already aging. And so destiny has really prepared a vacant place for Beethoven.
Vienna at this point is a city of palaces, and its court music is simply grander and on a bigger scale than anywhere else. It's also a hotbed of intrigues and cabals and musicians competing in the most bitter ways. He doesn't really know what his position is yet, but Beethoven knows he's studying with Haydn, the greatest composer in the world. Haydn had come through Bonn and discovered this amazing kid and said, come and study with me. And eventually Haydn writes back to Bonn, he is going to be one of the great musicians of Europe. He wants to learn, he wants to study counterpoint to improve his technique. He complains to other people that Haydn is not very rigorous as a counterpoint teacher. But he also has trouble with authority figures, because Beethoven is the most self-motivated, self-taught person imaginable.
He brings to Vienna several of his most recent pieces as showpieces for himself to brag with and to show to others what he's worth. But of course, he's also famous for his incredible improvisations. And he has a large arsenal of tools at his disposal, which he happily employs every time he has one of the very popular duels between pianists. Trills, double trills, triple trills. And perhaps one of the most striking ones is a duel which he has with Daniel Steibelt. His trick is tremolos. Steibelt arrives in Vienna. He does not pay his respects to Beethoven, which is a mistake. Then they are present at the same concert. Steibelt improvises on the theme of one of the movements of the piece which Beethoven played. And Beethoven sees it as an insult, which it probably is, a calculated challenge. And he stands up, goes to the piano, on the way, plucks a cello part of one of the pieces which Steibelt brought to that evening, puts it on the stand, turns it upside down, plucks 3 or 4 notes at random almost from the page and begins to improvise. And according to people who are present there, his improvisation is absolutely breathtaking. Steibelt evaporates. Even though he's already so known as quite probably the best piano player in Vienna, he is not yet there as a composer. And Beethoven is strategically plotting his path to fame as a composer as well.
One of the most important things for Beethoven is to make contact with the aristocrats. The aristocrats are very literate musical people. They are the ones who give concerts in their palaces, some of them on a weekly basis. And this is a network of people that meets regularly and that hosts the best musicians of the town.
Beethoven, like most musicians, had to find people who would pay for his works. He had to make a living as a teacher, as a composer. Seventh Prince Lobkowitz meets Beethoven in around 1790, and Lobkowitz is one of these people that thinks about how can I help him, and eventually comes up with an annuity to take away the problems. And so Beethoven is then able to create some of his most important works.
That is Lobkowitz's great contribution, I think. He made it possible for Beethoven to write the kind of music that he wanted to write, rather than necessarily what his patron wanted to hear. And that was very modern, new way.
Nowadays, we tend to think there's this old aristocracy, but it's not true. I mean, noblemen and noble women who supported Beethoven, they're about his age. I mean, they're in their early 20s, and so they are longing for fun in their palaces. And so they need a character like Beethoven, kind of a wild child, who is the right guy for that.
I think Beethoven's music is the essence of the revolutionary thinking, which of course swept all of Europe, starting in Paris, obviously, in the great French Revolution. This uprising was against the rule of the aristocracy, and the rule of the aristocracy was strongly connected with music. Beethoven received a lot of help from aristocratic patrons. And you would expect that if they give support, you have to return the gesture by composing something which glorifies them. Beethoven doesn't do that. I guess he doesn't have the politeness, or he doesn't have the interest to do so. He's free. He writes his own music. Give me support. They do. I write whatever I want.
This is a letter Beethoven writes to his very best friend, Franz Gerhard Wegeler. He addresses Wegeler as Liebster Bester, which means most loved, best one. And Wegeler is the only friend he addresses this way. So this is very special for Wegeler. In the time where this letter is written, Wegeler is with Beethoven in Vienna. And he writes this letter because he failed in friendship.
Dearest Wegeler, best of friends, in what an abominable light you have shown me to myself. I do not deserve your friendship. You are so noble, so indulgent, and now, for the first time, I am unworthy of you. How ashamed I am.
Beethoven, perhaps he insulted Wegeler, and afterwards he learned from others that this was perhaps not the best reaction to do.
Oh, Wegeler, don't reject this hand held out for reconciliation. I shall come to you myself and throw myself into your arms, imploring you to restore my lost friend, and you will give yourself to me, to your penitent, affectionate Beethoven.
So this is a very almost funny letter, because he throws himself to dust to say sorry. This happens very often, and Beethoven knows this from himself, and he has to say sorry to many of his friends for his whole lifetime.
Beethoven is not the lonely guy. He has many friends, but he's using his friends for his purposes. So he has, I would say, three kinds of friends. He has the nobility, guys where he puts pressure on to get money out of them. He admires them like Count Lichnowsky or Lobkowitz, but he's really using them. Then he has musician friends. He invites these musicians for dinner or for lunch to find out how to write for different instruments, to find out how they are. And then there are some people in between. Sometimes friends, sometimes just to be used to get for some purposes. One of them is this guy, Nicholas Mescal. He is a count from simple nobility, and he's really fighting to spend as much time with Beethoven as possible. There's one thing where Beethoven puts on a trio concerts. Mescal is supposed to play the cello, and then Beethoven finds a professional cellist, and he just kicks him out. And I think this is this inner feeling of the great master Beethoven, that everybody around him has to support his creative work. So he's taking what he can get.
In 1794, when Beethoven is 23 and thinks he's 25, he writes a note to himself.
Courage. In spite of all the weaknesses of my body, my spirit shall rule. You are 25. This year must determine the complete man. Nothing must remain undone.
He already understands that his body is betraying him. He's had trouble with his gut from his teens. He's had trouble with depression. He understands also that there's a self-realization involved. And he's making a vow here of the kind that a lot of people make. It's going to be different from now on. This is my New Year's resolution. But when Beethoven writes things like this, he means them and he acts on them.
1795 is an extremely pivotal year for Beethoven, both as a composer and as a musician. In October of this year, Beethoven brings out his Opus 1, his 3 piano trios. With Opus 1, Beethoven is essentially announcing his arrival and the completion of his studies, and he's making his mark as a serious composer. In this year, he has these 3 trios performed at the Lichnowsky Palace. He's having the 3rd trio in C minor performed.
The innovative part is the way he intensifies the development. He has little motifs which he develops in a kind of symphonic way. This was not usually done with chamber music. Haydn listened to them and seems to have said, yes, they're excellent works, but I wouldn't have published the 3rd one because I don't think the public will like that. This was because Haydn felt it was too intense for the public.
Beethoven is incredibly angry, and he thinks that Haydn is in fact trying to sabotage his career, because Beethoven believed that this was the best of the 3. Well, of course, C minor has been the most important key for Beethoven from the beginning, being one of the most characteristically pathetic keys, the one most reflective of this darker side of his personality.
Beethoven is a passionate man, and when he falls in love, he goes after it with the same intensity that he does his music.
Einsam wandelt dein Freund im Frühlingsgarten, mild vom lieblichen Zauberlicht umflossen, das durch wankende Blütenzweige zittert.
Adelaide has to do with a young singer named Magdalena Willmann who arrives from Bonn. She's beautiful, she's talented, he falls for her, and he takes up a poem that was around at the time named Adelaide.
Adelaide.
He possibly wrote it for her, he possibly wrote it as a matter of courtship. And it's about a man who is in love with a woman named Adelaide. He begins to see her name everywhere. Beethoven uses the name itself to build up to a kind of ecstatic climax, which is that name. Two things about Adelaide. Beethoven writes a fair number of songs over the years, but this was his hit tune. This was the one that really took off, and really that lasted essentially for the rest of his life. Secondly, he proposed to Magdalena Wihlmann because he had really fallen for her. And years later, I believe her daughter asked her, "Why didn't you marry him?" And she said, "Because he was ugly and half crazy." This kind of ferocious passion he brings to courtship is another example, not of his connection to other people, including women, but of his lack of it. He doesn't really know what his effect on people is. All he knows is what he feels.
I want to marry one of these beautiful young women of musical ambition who are noble women, which never will happen. There is a self-image in Beethoven that it's a narcissistic, overinflated idea of yourself. And he certainly had to deal with something like that all his life. And I think it has a lot to do with this addiction thing and the ambivalent relationship with his father.
He has a personality that is not easy to be around, because one moment you can be having a conversation and the next minute he's furious about something, or he's feeling affronted by something and he's in a rage. And this kind of conflicting amount of responses in short spaces of time means that it's not surprising that he has this difficulty with his colleagues and friends. We hear it all the time in his music. It's absolutely raw. The music, it doesn't answer him back. He can put it all there.
Right at the end of the 18th century, Beethoven's writing the 6 Opus 18s, his first adventure in string quartets. And of those 6, this Melancholia is the most extraordinary thing. Melancholia is an amazing movement and very unusual because it has that particular title, Melancholia, melancholy. That's an instruction to the performers of how the music should be. Then after this amazing slow introduction, shocking and dissonant, and there's no real sense of where he's going with the music. We go into something that's completely different, very cheerful, elegant. Seemingly, the melancholy has been banished, never to return. And then it does come back. It's a memory, but it's significant. It places a doubt. The melancholia, the melancholy, is going to be what we remember from this piece after we've had the last fanfare. It's particularly clear somehow that Beethoven himself is a complex human being who's grappling with extremes of emotion and not necessarily always able to resolve them in his personal relationships particularly, and then being daring enough to put that in the music. The way Beethoven's music works is it articulates the human condition in ways that you didn't realize existed.
My ears continue to ring and hiss day and night. I must say that I lead a wretched life. For 2 years, I've avoided nearly all company, since it is impossible for me to tell people that I am deaf.
Here is Ludwig in his 20s, when he knows something serious is going wrong. He's losing his hearing, the most important thing that he needs. From year dot, he's had his life put in front of him by his father. You will be that prodigy. You will be that virtuoso. You will be the greatest musician that ever was born. So that when he knows he is losing the most precious sensibility, his hearing, this is sending him into a terrible state of despair. What is he going to do? He can't tell anyone. He can't share it. He has to just try and cope with the awful reality of losing his hearing.
You do go through a process whereby you think that hearing is coming through the ears and you want more through there, and you get frustrated that that isn't the case. I suspect there might have been that situation with Beethoven, and we're desperate and frustrated and angry that things weren't coming through here. They might have been distorted, it could have been painful, distant. All of those things might have happened at the same time, and he was not in control of that. When you begin to lose a particular sense, all the other senses become razor sharp, and it can take a while for you to realize that. When I began losing my hearing from the age of 8, I must have been naturally looking at people more and face reading more, but I had no idea I was actually doing that. It was just a natural thing to happen. But I don't believe that he was just simply losing his hearing where things were becoming more and more faded. I think certain sounds, certain frequencies were becoming less controllable. Depends on the acoustics he was in, depends on the piano he might have played, depends on the piece of music, the dynamic, depends what he was wearing, all sorts of things like that. Just the sheer energy of paying attention, you know, if you're tired, you hear less, you know, you do.
To give you an idea of this strange deafness, let me tell you that at the theatre, I must lean in very near to the orchestra in order to understand the actor. If I'm some distance away, I do not hear the higher notes of the instruments and voices. I'm surprised that there are people who've never noticed it in conversation. Since I am often distracted, they attribute it to that.
So it seems that the high frequencies that he's hearing are missing. And also he mentions that he can't hear quiet sounds, but when sounds are loud, he's finding it unbearable. And from an ear surgeon's point of view, that pushes towards the type of hearing loss that he may be suffering from. Well, that's to say it's a problem with the actual receptor of hearing, the cochlea. It's deep inside the temporal bone, right in the middle of the skull, and it's there to give it a very protected environment. In those situations, patients tend initially to lose the high frequencies, and they often have a problem hearing quiet sounds, but find loud sounds very unpleasant. So I think Beethoven's probably suffering from a sensory hearing loss. For Beethoven, his problem is probably differentiating timbre of different instruments, and particularly if his hearing loss, which we think it is more high frequency, then he's going to lose the top instruments, the piccolos, the flutes, the top of the violin, whilst maintaining the lower frequencies, and that's going to distort the overall perception of what he's hearing. So socially, if you have uncorrected severe or profound loss, it's very difficult to take part in conversations. So patients typically become isolated. They withdraw from conversation, they sit, they don't take part, they don't interact.
I've been playing Beethoven's music all of my life. And as a musician, hearing is pretty vital. Hearing is automatic, but listening takes a special knack. And listening is one of the greatest of the skills that we are taught when we learn music. So for Ludwig, to be losing this one important element of his senses during his mid-20s has to be the cruelest form of torture for any young man.
Oh, if I were free from this, I should embrace the world. My youth, yes, I feel it is only beginning now. Every day I draw nearer to the goal that I can sense, but not describe. Grant me only partial release from my affliction, and you shall see me as joyful as it is possible to be here on earth. I shall seize fate by the throat. It shall never wholly subdue me.
I mean, it's very sort of ear-catching to think of Beethoven as this huge sort of, forceful, unwashed character, if you like. But, I mean, he's just so much more than that. Those other sides of Beethoven, especially the more introspective side of Beethoven, can be overlooked. The Moonlight Sonata is... there's nothing else quite like it. We like to think of the Moonlight Sonata in this very sort of romantic way. Sort of course, the romantic image of moonlight across the lake and all that, but it's really nothing to do with that. It's one of... Certainly the first movement is one of the movements that relates most closely to death in all of his piano sonatas. There's something of a distance about that. There's something a little bit sort of removed and untouchable about it. There's no warmth to it at all, really.
In 1802, Beethoven is 31 at this time. Beethoven's doctor recommends that he go spend some quiet time out in the country in the hopes of letting his hearing recover. He goes to the town of Heiligenstadt. He spends some time there alone, and during that time does a lot of soul searching and thinks about the problem that he is facing. He is taking a walk with his friend Ferdinand Ries, and Ries hears a shepherd playing on a flute, and Beethoven is forced to acknowledge that he doesn't hear it. So, in a sense, the facade falls down for him. He can no longer pretend, even to his closest friends, that he has normal hearing.
When Beethoven writes the Heiligenstadt Testament, which is a letter to his brothers, this is the moment when he realizes that it's not going to get better. So it's a raw documentation of grief, of tragedy.
Oh, you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you. Forgive me when you see me withdraw from you, with whom I would so gladly mingle. Completely isolated, I only enter society when compelled to do so. I must live like an exile.
This letter is a number of things at the same time. It's partly a suicide note. It's a statement of defiance. He finally says, I can't leave this world without having done what I know I can do. It's partly a credo, an artistic credo, and I think in part it's an exorcism. It's a way of getting down on paper everything that he's feeling at that moment so he can go on.
But what a humiliation for me when someone standing next to me heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing. Such incidents drove me almost to despair. A little more of that, and I would have ended my life. It seemed to me impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me.
So he finishes the letter to his brothers, I believe, makes a clear copy of it from a draft, and he seals it, seeming to imply that he's planning to mail it, though he didn't. And then he just instinctively, in a gush of emotion, he writes on the outside,
Thus I bid you farewell. And indeed, sadly, yes, that fond hope which I brought here with me, to be cured to a degree at least, this I must now wholly abandon. As the leaves of autumn fall and are withered, so likewise has my hope been blighted. Almost as I came, I depart.
If he had actually committed suicide, as he suggests he was considering, this would be taken as the suicide note. But as deep as the despair seems to be in this document, it didn't push him over the edge. I think writing it down may have even helped him not to do that.
O Providence, grant me at last but one day of pure joy. It is so long since real joy echoed in my heart. Never? No, that would be too hard.
The Heiligenstadt Testament is actually a moment of great clarity. He sees the future. The penny has dropped. He knows what's going to happen to him in many ways. And he knows that he is going to try to preserve his art under extraordinary circumstances. He's going to go deaf. And he doesn't know yet how he's going to manage to do it when he's deaf, but he knows that he's going to try. He knows he's going to be unhappy. He sees what's coming, and he accepts it. Beethoven had about as much courage as a human being can have.
For me, there are two astonishing things about the Heiligenstadt Testament which are often overlooked. One of them is that Beethoven does not send this, but instead he preserves it for the rest of his life, carefully. It's found in his desk at his death. The second very astonishing fact about this is that while you might think that the Heiligenstadt Testament is this very depressive document which might signal that Beethoven's going to remain depressed for quite some time, in fact, Beethoven comes back to Vienna, he resumes working right away, and he writes some of the most astonishing masterworks that he's written to date.
I'm not satisfied with what I've composed up to now. From now on, I intend to embark on a new path.
And this new element, the new style of Beethoven, is not necessarily beautiful. It's sometimes aggressive. In the third symphony, there is a passage where the rhythm goes against the regular beat. I heard stories what actually happened in the first performance, that people play this tick, 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 tick. This rhythm against the beat, and the orchestra got confused and they had to start all over again. This is obvious because it was so modern, and Beethoven always comes with something new. He's an innovator, a real innovator. And he's not interested anymore in the bon goût, as they said, the good taste, but our feelings, the human soul. And I think the deafness helped him to find his self, which was, of course, a very new idea, to find the inner voice. And when you perceive, really understand what is inside you in this magnified way, then music emerges, which is, as we know in Beethoven's music, has such a huge heart that it's big enough to embrace the whole world. Beethoven is the giant who created the new world. Everybody after Beethoven copies Beethoven. Everybody. Liszt, Mahler, Schönberg, everybody. Music has changed. There is music before Beethoven and there is music after Beethoven. And music after Beethoven is an army of musicians following his direction.
He's 38 years old. Isn't it time he got married? So he's looking for a wife.
Beethoven always falls in love with the same type of woman. Beautiful, young, aristocratic, and with a love for music.
She couldn't imagine at all marrying this composer.
Some have proposed that he is going after women he knows are not available because he's protecting himself and his art, and I don't believe that. I think that he just never quite got the message.